Okay, welcome back to another narrated lecture. This lecture will cover the information in Chapter 10, Part 1. This is an introduction to photosynthesis. And you can use this lecture in conjunction with the printable versions of the slides and also the Chapter 10, Part 1 lecture review sheet. Let's get started. All right, we're going to discuss what photosynthesis is, why it's important, and the overall reactions of photosynthesis. So first, what is photosynthesis? Well, photosynthesis is a set of chemical reactions in which living things convert solar energy from the sun into chemical energy. And this chemical energy can be stored by living cells. So when plants, for instance, are photosynthesizing, they're capturing that solar energy inside sugars. And then they can use those sugars to build their bodies. They can also use those sugars as an energy source later, for instance, in the winter, when there isn't much sunlight. This is the photosynthetic equation. So this is the overall reaction. Now you're going to see in part 2 of the lecture that this will be broken down into a number of smaller reactions. But let's just get the overall view for now. So what happens during this reaction is that carbon dioxide on the left is taken in from the atmosphere. Water is taken in by the roots if you're talking about a plant, different ways if you're talking about algae. And then light energy is captured from the sun. And that light energy is used to convert the CO2 into glucose. Now it takes 6 CO2 molecules to make 1 glucose sugar. So it takes quite a bit of energy to put these sugars together. Glucose isn't the only sugar that can be built by this process, but it's a major one. So we'll talk about it as an example. This process also releases oxygen gas, and that's the oxygen gas that we breathe. Now in the diagram in the middle of the slide, you can see the relationship between the chloroplasts and the mitochondrion found inside plant cells. Chloroplasts undergo photosynthesis. So they produce sugars and they produce this oxygen gas. And those products are the reactants needed by the mitochondria. The mitochondria take in these reactants. They undergo cellular respiration and they produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct and water. And both of those chemicals are reactants needed for photosynthesis. So these two organelles work really well together. Plant cells have both. They have the chloroplast to build the sugars and the mitochondria to break them down later to make ATP. Now our cells, animal cells, don't have chloroplasts. We only have mitochondria. So we have to eat plants or eat other animals in order to get those sugars. And of course we breathe in the oxygen. Next, we're going to briefly discuss why photosynthesis is important. Some sources refer to photosynthesis as the most important biological reaction. So why is that? Well, photosynthesizers, these things we call producers, provide all of the other life on this planet with food and also with oxygen. So that's kind of important. For instance, in the food chain that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, algae are able to capture the sun's energy. And then little organisms such as plankton feed on that algae and they take in that chemical energy and use it to build their bodies. The fish then eats that plankton. It's transferred into the fish, and humans eat the fish and transfer that into their own bodies. Another way to get this chemical energy is to eat the plants directly. So as the little kid on the right is demonstrating, whenever you eat an apple or a plant product, you are directly taking in that chemical energy that was captured by that plant. And so in a sense, we are all solar powered. Photosynthesizers provide us all with food. This is just a fun diagram I found online of a food chain from the human perspective. Humans, of course, are high on the food chain. We are also really good at being omnivores, so we'll eat just about anything. Okay? And some of my favorites on that diagram are the poodle and the bat and the slug. We'll eat everything. Okay? But the energy in those organisms ultimately came from the sun and was ultimately captured by photosynthesizers. Okay. The other important product of photosynthesis is oxygen gas. We all need oxygen gas in order to perform respiration. This map shows the global distribution of photosynthesis, and what you're looking for are the darker colors. So on land, you can see there are darker colors around, let me point out it, for instance, Brazil, around the equator, you see a lot of photosynthesis, and up here in North America and Northern Europe. Now, those dark colors occur there because there are vast forests in those areas, and those photosynthesizers produce a lot of oxygen. You're also going to notice dark colors in the oceans, though, these dark blue bands here and here and here and here. So what's producing those? Well, that's algae. And actually, the majority of the oxygen in the atmosphere comes from algae, phytoplankton, in the ocean, performing photosynthesis. Right. Now, to give you a little historical perspective on photosynthesis and why it's important, I want to tell you about something called the oxygen revolution. If you imagine the Earth somewhere between 2 and 3 billion years ago, you have to imagine a pretty different place. The atmosphere of the Earth at this time was pretty toxic. Lots of carbon compounds, lots of sulfur compounds. It would have been very hot. There was no ozone layer, so UV radiation just poured into the atmosphere. Lots of volcanic activity, very erratic weather, very erratic oceanic behavior as well. So really not a very hospitable place for living things. And yet there were living things. They were very simple, single-celled organisms, very likely prokaryotic. And at a certain point, some of these cells began to photosynthesize. So they could suddenly take in all these nice carbon compounds, capture the sun's energy, and they could release oxygen gas, which they did quite a bit. Now, they continued to do so, and they continued to proliferate over the next 2 to 3 billion years, so that today's atmosphere actually contains about 20% oxygen. 2 to 3 billion years ago, it contained a very small percentage of oxygen comparatively. So these photosynthesizers, through collective action over a long period of time, were actually able to change the content of the Earth's atmosphere. This event is known as the oxygen revolution, sometimes known as the oxygen catastrophe. And the reason is that when all this nice oxygen began to appear in the oceans and in the atmosphere, it benefited some types of cells that could tolerate oxygen, but it was catastrophic to forms of life that cannot tolerate oxygen, things we call obligate anaerobes. They do not like oxygen. So this oxygen revolution represents a fundamental shift in the types of life that were favored by the environments on the Earth. It promoted the reproduction of those that could tolerate oxygen, and those that could not tended to die off. Today, the dominant forms of life on this planet are capable of performing photosynthesis and or aerobic respiration, both of which involve oxygen. So these photosynthesizers not only changed the planet, they changed the course of evolution of life. Pretty powerful stuff. All right, another reason that photosynthesis is important is because of the products we get from it. Okay. Think about all the products we get from plants. We get food for ourselves and livestock. We get textiles such as cotton and wood to build things out of. And we also get pharmaceuticals, medicines that can help cure disease. By being able to manipulate the photosynthetic process, we can cause plants to make the products that we want. Here's an article that illustrates this. I'd like you to pause this video and go find this article at the link provided. It's also available under useful links. Read it and answer the questions provided in your lecture review sheet. It's talking about a fairly recent scientific breakthrough about how scientists were able to manipulate photosynthesis and make it more efficient. Pretty neat stuff, right? So go read the article and then come back. All right, hopefully you read that article and enjoyed it. The other aspect of this I want to talk to you about very briefly in terms of manipulating photosynthesis is this thing we call the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle describes how carbon compounds are able to enter the atmosphere and how they are able to leave the atmosphere. And this is of vital importance. I think we're going to see even more focus on this in the future. Essentially, it tells us that carbon enters and leaves the atmosphere in a couple of ways. Anything that produces carbon and releases it into the atmosphere, we refer to these things as carbon sources. So when we breathe out, when animals such as cows and fish, when they breathe out, they release CO2 from respiration. When we burn fossil fuels, that releases large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. So we refer to these things as carbon sources. Now, other parts of the system will behave as carbon sinks. Carbon sinks remove carbon from the atmosphere. So photosynthesizers take in CO2. They capture them in sugars, and they use those sugars to build their bodies and also for energy. Algae in the ocean do this. Trees on the land and other plants on the land do this as well. Now, when these organisms die and become buried, some of them can gradually turn into fossil fuels, things like coal, oil, and natural gas. Now, these pools of energy represent millions and millions of living things that passed away and millions of years of conversion. So these are gigantic pools of energy, gigantic sources or sinks of carbon if they stay under the ground. One of the major problems we're running into right now is that when you pull up these fossil fuels, you take them out of the ground where they've been relatively captured, and you burn them to run cars and factories and produce electricity, you release millions of years of carbon that's been sequestered underground back into the atmosphere. And so what we're seeing right now is a very large increase in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and a relative decrease in the amount of oxygen. Because think about this, at the same time that we are releasing all this fossil fuel, we are also destroying the photosynthesizers. We're cutting down rainforest, we're poisoning the oceans where the algae live. So this is a problem, right? Look at these two graphs. This bottom graph down here shows levels of CO2 in the atmosphere over time, and it's actually over thousands of years. Scientists gather this information by studying rock formations and also studying glaciers, things like that, atmosphere trapped inside ice. And look what's happening at the very end, right down here in just the last 100 years or so. Look at the level of CO2 relative to what we've seen over the past few thousand years. It's inordinately, that's fun to say, high. The atmosphere now contains unprecedented levels of CO2s, methanes, and other carbon compounds. Now, this is a problem because these gases are what are known as greenhouse gases. They trap heat. And so as these gases increase in the atmosphere, we're trapping more heat. That's what's resulting in what's known as global warming. Now, despite what you might see on various media sources, scientists pretty much agree that something is happening here, although we don't understand it entirely. Of course not, that's science. And it's really hard to ignore this fundamental shift in the carbon cycle. There are far more carbon sources than there are carbon sinks, and things are getting thrown out of whack. So how can we combat this? Well, if you've got too many carbon sinks, you can carbon sources. You can reduce the carbon sources. You can have a smaller carbon footprint by reducing your own carbon footprint. and industrially doing that as well. You can also increase the carbon sinks. What you can see from this graph is that oxygen levels are actually at a low, not a historic low. They've been lower in the past, but oxygen levels are pretty low too. And that's because we're chopping down rainforest and destroying the photosynthesizers. So we need to increase our carbon sinks and decrease our carbon sources. And so you can do that by planting trees, by choosing certain plants in your yards and your gardens that are excellent carbon sinks. And then there's some interesting technology looking at making biofuels out of carbon sinks. So the picture at the top there shows someone next to a crop of switchgrass. Switchgrass grows very, very fast every season, so it's an excellent carbon sink. And that biomass can be used to make fuel. And it's what's known as carbon neutral because it's not releasing any new carbon into the atmosphere, whereas burning fossil fuels definitely does. So there is hope for the future if we choose to make changes and stick to it. To further illustrate this, I would like you to watch this neat video on algae fuel. I'd like you to watch the video and answer the questions in your lecture review sheets. So go and do that, and then come back and we will do some more lecture. All right, hopefully you went and watched the video. I think it's a really neat one. Talking about the potential of photosynthesis. All right, now back to our introduction to photosynthesis. What we need to discuss next are the types of cells that can photosynthesize. And there are a few shown here. Cells that can photosynthesize are known as autotrophs, or producers, because they produce sugars. There are unicellular forms and multicellular forms. You may recognize some of the unicellular forms because you looked at them during Lab 4. The top two pictures there show you cyanobacteria. These are prokaryotic cells, and these are some of the oldest known photosynthesizers on the planet. They go back 3 billion years. There's even fossils of them that are 3 billion years old, if you can believe that. The middle two show eukaryotic, unicellular photosynthesizers. There's euglena on the left, which you did get to see. And some of you may have gotten to see Volvox on the right, little spheres that roll around. They're multicellular or colonial. All right. And finally, there are multicellular photosynthesizers as well. On the left, you can see plant cells from Elodea that you got to see in lab. And on the right, you can see a kelp forest. Now, kelp is actually an algae. It's not a plant, even though it looks like a plant. It's built a little differently. But that multicellular algae is an excellent photosynthesizer. You find these kelp forests off the coast of California. All right, let's talk a little bit more about eukaryotic photosynthesizers, such as plants and algae and some of the protists. Now, all of these photosynthesizers are going to use chloroplasts. So if you look inside these cells, for instance, you'll see the little green dots. Those are the chloroplasts. Plants are more complex than the algae and the protists. Plants are multicellular, and they have organs and organ systems. So they're going to have complex things such as roots, stems, and leaves that help move the products of photosynthesis around. Brings water up, it moves sugars around. Things like algae and protists, on the other hand, have to depend on diffusion to do this for them. So they're quite a bit simpler than a plant. But they all use chloroplasts. That's a neat little video if you want to watch it. I'm not going to show it right now, but it shows what's known as cytoplasmic streaming. And you can actually see cytoplasm moving inside the cell and the chloroplast getting washed around inside the cell. So check that out if you feel like it. All right, next we're going to discuss prokaryotic photosynthesizers. Now these prokaryotic cells lack chloroplasts. Remember, they don't have membrane-bound organelles, but they can still perform photosynthesis. So what they use for at least the light reactions, which we'll talk about, is something called the photosynthetic lamellae. And you can see it in this picture here. This is an electron microscope picture of the membrane of a prokaryotic cell. And you can see the membrane here, and you can see that inside the membrane, sorry, that line there is the membrane. Inside, it's been folded back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. That is the photosynthetic lamellae. Now, attached to that membrane, you'll find a number of different little machines that help cells perform photosynthesis. The second part of photosynthesis has to be performed inside the cytoplasm itself. All right. Now we're going to focus on eukaryotic photosynthesis. So in order to do so, we need to discuss these chloroplasts. This is what a chloroplast looks like. And it has two membranes. It has an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And that inner membrane is folded into these weird coin-looking things. These things are called thylakoids. Now you might notice that the thylakoids are green in color, and that's because they contain chlorophyll, which is a green pigment we'll talk about. And a stack of these things is referred to as a granum. This is going to be the site of the first half of photosynthesis, these things we call the light reactions. The other part of the chloroplast to be aware of is this liquid. There's a thick liquid between the inner membrane and the thylakoids. So it's floating around kind of outside these thylakoids. And that is going to be the site of the second half of photosynthesis, which we call the dark reactions, or light independent. All right, now the last thing we need to discuss in this particular lecture are the two major reactions that make up photosynthesis. Photosynthesis can very conveniently be split into two halves, the photo part and the synthesis part. The photo part of photosynthesis is where the light is going to be captured. So think photo, photons, light. So they're called light dependent, or the light reactions. Now, what's going to actually happen during these reactions? Well, light's going to be captured. Energy is going to be captured. Now, we need to capture it inside chemicals. So these are the chemicals that will actually be used to capture the energy, ADP and NADP+. These chemicals will be converted into ATP and NADPH. So ADP will be phosphorylated, which captures a little energy, and NADP+ will be reduced into NADPH. So this is the chemical energy that's been captured from the sun. Now, another thing that's going to happen during this reaction is that water will be changed into oxygen gas. This is where the oxygen gas comes from. And we'll talk about why it does that in the second half of the lecture. All right, so now we've captured the sun's energy. What are we going to do with it? Well, in the second half of photosynthesis, the synthesis part, or the light independent reactions, sometimes called the dark reactions, which sounds cooler, that chemical energy that's captured is going to be used to build a longer storage molecule, to build sugars. So here we can see that happening. The ATP and the NADPH are going to provide the energy to build CO2 into sugars such as glucose. So look what happens to these energy carriers. ATP is dephosphorylated into ADP, and NADPH is oxidized back into NADP+. And that energy is released, is used to build CO2s into glucose. This set of reactions happens in the stroma of the chloroplast, so it happens in the liquidy part of that chloroplast. And it does not require light. All right, now these two sets of reactions are dependent on one another. Notice that the reactants needed for the dark reactions are the products produced by the light reactions. And the same is true here. The products of the light reactions are the reactants, or the dark reactions are the reactants for the light reactions. So if one set of these reactions shuts down, the other set of reactions does not occur. Okay. Here's your last your turn question for this particular section. I want you to read the question and see what you think about it. Jot down your answer. I kind of already told you the answer in the last slide if you were paying attention, okay? But we'll see what you come up with. Okay. All right, that's the end of the Chapter 10 Part 1 lecture. You are now ready to attend the Chapter 10 Part 2 lecture, where we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of these reactions. We're going to see how the light reactions capture energy and how the dark reactions build sugars. I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you very much for watching.